Welcome, everyone, to Gems from the Wisdom Traditions, a conversation circle sponsored by Still and Moving Center every Saturday afternoon, in which this week we are doing a really interesting follow-up from last week's topic. Last week, we were looking at karma and transformation. This week, we are looking at yoga and will. We're very fortunate to have with us Piyush Kumar. He was born into, had a chance to go out on his own and do very many other things and study in many traditions, and to a certain extent now has returned back to the Kashmiri Shaivite tradition of Hinduism. And he is going to speak to us today on this topic of yoga and will. And in part, he'll be referring to Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. I do want to mention that he's been at Microsoft for about 6 years, and he is dealing with AI, community supportive, and innovation. And he's got wonderful plans about how AI can actually help us into the future, communicating very closely with one another in community. So it's a very positive way of looking at it. I'm very thrilled about that. Anyway, this idea of yoga and will, we'll read the quote for this week in our almanac. Yoga is skill in the performance of actions. Therefore, do thou aspire to this devotion, by Krishna. Okay, Piyush, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Renee. Thanks for the very lovely and warm introduction. And it's been a while since I have joined this circle, and it's such a pleasure to see familiar faces. And it just always brings me joy. And I'm sort of coming in a very interesting space right here because, Renee very kindly shared about some of the AI stuff I've been working on. So I'm currently in this place called Holden Village, which is sort of this Lutheran camp. I mean, they have a legacy of a Lutheran a kind of denomination, but they're very much a very open camp. I mean, I've met Sufis here and Buddhists here and indigenous scholars here, and just so many. I've been coming here for many years. And this is a camp deep into the mountains of Washington State, which, if you are familiar with Washington State, we have a pretty large backcountry here. And a lot of that backcountry is very remote. So to get here, I have to drive 4 hours and then take a ferry for 3 hours. And then they pick me up on a bus. And that's another an hour ride. Although distance-wise, if I was to draw a straight line from my home to here, it's maybe only like 80 miles or something. So you can imagine, it's really out there. And this is a very self-sustained community. And I'll be talking about AI and consciousness next week here. So I'm doing a 4-part series on that. Which sort of relates with all this practice, and specifically, when Renee talked about will and yoga, this was just very, very poignant in the way it connects with what I've been talking about, consciousness and AI. So to get started, I guess there's this very famous phrase in the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra, which is called Yoga Chitta Vritti Nirodha. A lot of people are familiar with it. It also became very famous after the Ananda Institute, specifically Yogananda, sort of used to use it quite a bit, I think, and that's why it came out in the vocabulary of the people who follow the Ananda Institute and so on. But basically, what it means is, so yoga. I'll talk about yoga more. So let's just think of yoga just as yoga here. So chitta is referred to as consciousness. Sometimes it could be referred to as just mind consciousness. And vritti means the whirlwinds and the whirlpools. And nirodha means sort of canceling or negating that. So yoga chitta vritti nirodha means yoga as a practice that negates the whirlpools of the mind. So that's just what it translates to, and it's if you see the Sanskrit version of the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, you'll see this phrase show up in many different places. And I do happen to have a recording from some of the Sanskrit scholars back in India who sing out in the traditional way Sanskrit is spoken out the entire sutra of Patanjali, and I could see that phrase come up very often, and it's such an interesting experience. So when we talk about yoga, one of the ways in this context to understand yoga is it's a practice that allows us to negate the whirlpools of the mind by cultivating concentration. So that's one way how people describe it. And concentration is, in this way, what it means is that the mind is not kind of lost in all the senses and floating around and trying to make meaning of all the senses, but rather than it is experiencing the senses, it understands the senses, it knows the senses, and it's has a single pointed focus in the sense of clarity, right? And that's a key word. Yoga also means the path towards union. So that's, I think, a little bit more broader and more encompassing sort of interpretation of yoga. So when we interpret yoga in that way, there's a lot of practices, both Eastern practices and Western practices that sort of can fit that categorization of yoga as a path towards union, right? So now as we kind of go deeper into it, right, and there's, the theme here we started with is will and yoga, right? And will is a very interesting word. It's a word that's not quite, you can't really explain it in long form text kind of a thing. It's a very experiential word in the way that's used in this context, right? I mean, we use the word will in so many different ways, right? I mean, we use the word will in a day-to-day vocabulary, such as I will do this, right? So there is a sense of it's so common, right? And we have different interpretations based on how we are using it. But will in the sense of yoga and in the sense of some of these spiritual traditions, it has a very non-dualistic sort of meaning to it. And I'll get to that. But before I get to that, and the reason I want to pause before I get to it is because I want to lay down the sutras of Patanjali in the ways we understand it very well, and it's known, right? And that's the 8 limbs of yoga. So I want to start there, and then we'll see if we can make our way back towards this aspect of will. So one of the key things about the Patanjali's Yoga Sutra is the 8 limbs, as we are, maybe some of us are familiar with it. And the 8 limbs starts with these 2 things called yam and niyam, right? Yam basically translates to control, or more specifically, maybe self-control. And niyam translates to the opposite side of the self-control, which is, again, there's no direct translation to it, but it's maybe something like positive practices that you can cultivate within yourself. And what I want to start with is maybe giving a description of the yam and niyams in a way that will allow us to come to this essence of will. And hopefully, maybe I can also make a connection to the Kuan Yin conversation that Renée mentioned might have happened last week, right? And the whole idea of karma and so on. So the very first yam we want to start with is non-violence, right? And again, trying to remember that yam means self-control, right? So we are talking about non-violence in the sense of self-control. what does nonviolence mean, right? I mean, many people over the ages have interpreted nonviolence as, don't harm other people, don't harm other beings, and so on, right? And that's true and very well, but that's a very kind of like exoteric or mundane way, a phenomenal way of talking about nonviolence, right? Um, it's a way in which when people are entering into a practice of yoga and sort of just trying to like learn the vocabulary of yoga and learn all these things, right? It just makes it easier to start in this very exoteric, phenomenal way of practicing nonviolence. But nonviolence actually is a very internal practice. It's less so as external, right? And the reason is because life is much more complex than just saying that don't kill other beings, right? Um, there is a way in which life flows, and there's a circle of life that we are all familiar with, and there's the samskara that we live under, where there is a way in which life and death and killing also happens, right? But internally, what nonviolence actually translates to, or could translate to in this way, is a sense of non-judgment. So it's every time we choose or we get into a space of judgment, we actually are also stepping into some form of violence. And this is a very subtle way of practicing it and thinking about it. And the reason for that is very simple, right? Because when we judge something, we assign value to it, right? We say this is good, and because we assign value to it of goodness, then anything opposite to it is bad, right? And whatever is bad, we don't want to deal with that. We want to prevent that from happening. We through different means. People use different means to actually do that. But all those means are a form of violence, right? Typically, like when we don't want to deal with something, we are saying that that does not belong here. It's not me. It doesn't live here. And if I am expressing that more aggressively or more outwardly, then I might actually do inflict physical or external violence. If I'm experiencing it internally, then I am also experiencing violence where, to start with, I'm actually separating myself from that thing. And that itself is a space of violence, right? And then internally also, the things that I have to shut down for me to not like something and like something, that is also a space of violence. So in this way, one of the routes to understand violence is through the essence of judgment, right? And if I was to go a little bit more cosmically, for some of us who are oriented that way, um, whenever we actually step into that space of judgment, we actually also step into the cycle, the samskara of life in a way where we break the present moment into a series of time, past, present, and future. So we move from the nowness of something to this breaking of time, or what we say, we move away from the flow state of being with life into a sense of that life is, in these frameworks of past, present, and future. We're always trying to run away from the past, trying to grasp, or hope for the future, or trying to grasp the past and trying for the future to resemble the past in some way, right? So there is again, that's also a form of judgment, right? So we see how time has a very special way in which it plays out whenever we step into judgment. So the very first yam just basically says, let's not divide ourselves with anything, really, right? Let's not divide ourselves over time, or let's not divide ourselves over values and judgments. Let's just be with the true nature of how things are. And when we step into that, then every being has a luminous quality to it that belongs in this space and time. So that's one way to understand it. The second yam is it translates to self-deception or falsehood. So this is in a way kind of very clear in the sense of like self-deception is, in a way when we are not being honest, right, to ourselves or to the other people. So that's where we can understand when we hear that word. But as it so happens, right, there is also a very there's a deeper meaning to that too, and the deeper meaning around that, in that sense, is that where we do not really trust ourselves in a deeper sense, when we don't trust ourselves. So what this yam is asking us to do is to control that whirlpool of mind that inflicts the self-deception, where we forget nature or essential nature, or um, the true sense of who we are. Um, and the way it shows up is in the ways where we seek validation from the outside, right? Where we justify who we are through the series and processes of thoughts and so on. And that's one place to see where this energy of deception slash non-deception is playing out as well. Now, I'm not saying that this is to sort of this movement of justifying or trying to understand ourselves is not right. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that in this practice of yoga, we step into this different reality where we are practicing to let go of all of those things, because the path of yoga is the path of union. And whatever is union is the true consciousness, right? So it's a practice. It's not something that we do that for every situation in the ways that I'm describing, but it's a practice that helps us to show up to these situations in a more conscious way, in a more enlightened way, in a more wise way, if you will. And so what happens is when we deceive ourselves, right? And this particular yam is very much connected to the primordial wisdom of the universe, right? So what I'm saying, really trust ourselves, is what I'm saying is that trust the universal energy that is the universal life that is flowing through everything. And in this way, we are trusting ourselves as someone who's not separate and different from anything else as well. So it's a real trust in this non-dual existence of life in that way, right? So if there is a reaction, an emotional reaction we're feeling, if there is a some kind of like thought patterns that we are feeling, it's an understanding that this actually lives in an ecosystem, if you will, right? It's not an independent thing that's living inside me that I have to fix. It's living in this ecosystem that I am somehow um, stewarding that energy in this way, right? And the practice of yoga says that, well, let's come to that recognition of the universal existence of our life, of ourselves, right? And that's the primordial sound. Om is what it's connected with. It's recognizing that everything came from the one essence, right? The one reality, the one sound, the first word. Um, so then we move to the third yam, and this is the yam of non-clinging. It's the yam that is associated with all sorts of addiction and obsession and so on. And this yam is there is a deep sense of confusion present with this yam, what this yam is actually trying to overcome. The confusion is that if I cling to something, then I'll be okay or I'll be well, right? And it's really recognizing that essence of wellness, that essence of happiness, that essence of maybe even more broadly blissfulness, is not associated with the form nature of things. It's associated with a true existence. So in yoga and in many Hindu and Buddhist traditions, there's this word called Sat Chit Anand, right? what it says is that Sat means truth, Chit means conscious, and Anand means bliss. So what it says is that whatever is true and conscious is blissful, and whatever is blissful and conscious is truth, right? So we don't. So that's just the fundamental reality of our existence, is that it's inherently blissful in that way. We step out of that blissfulness because of this confusions of the mind, the whirlpools of the mind, the way we make cause and effect. It's in a way the games that we play, that we choose to step out from the experience of that bliss into the playing of this game, because somehow this game has a very powerful meaning to it, right? And again, yoga says that, well, if we do practice non-clinging or non-attachment, as it's broadly called, then we can come back to the experience of that blissfulness, right? And again, there is so much more to it, but I'm just going really quickly this thing. So the fourth yam is, it's called, in Sanskrit, it's called brahmacharya, right? And along many ages, people have associated brahmacharya with celibacy, right? But brahmacharya, actually, the word does not mean celibacy. Celibacy can be a form of practicing brahmacharya, but it does not mean celibacy, right? And that's one of the key things to also understand. Brahmacharya really means, it's composed of two words, Brahma and Acharya, right? So Brahma is the universal reality, and Acharya is the one who realizes, the supreme teacher, if you will. So it's basically saying that it's the practice of recognizing the universal reality. That's all it means, right? And in many traditions, both East and West, this has translated into celibacy, because celibacy has been and is still a very legitimate form of experiencing brahmacharya, because there is a way in which, when we practice celibacy, then we let go of our attachments. And when we practice celibacy, we let go of finding bliss through these experiences, or through these orgasmic experiences, rather than coming back to like our true existence and recognizing that that bliss exists in this universal reality, and it's all around us. In fact, it is us, right? And it's interesting because yeah, I mean, there's a lot of nuances to this word of brahmacharya. So if we understand that this word really means practicing awareness of this universal intelligence, what that also means is that kind of like going away from cause and effect in the ways things are done, into a sense of focus and into a sense of concentration towards that universal reality. And some of the practices that yoga, both the Patanjali's yoga as well as other forms of yoga that presents around this essence of brahmacharya, can become very intense. They can become very intense, and that's by the nature of it. The reason for that is because it is really a practice around sort of like canceling or negating a lot of these tendencies of the human experience that wants to spread out, that wants to multiply, our senses, and provide meaning to individual senses, and provide meaning to individual experiences. And it really brings that into one reality, just the one reality. And the one reality is that all of this is playing out in this luminous universal field. That's all. And if I was to use like maybe a Buddhist way of describing it, fundamentally the essence of everything that exists is emptiness. They don't really they are inherently empty in the sense of what they are, and whatever existence they have comes through a projection of those existences. and it's coming back to that reality and understanding that it is because of that emptiness. If we let go of the multiplicity of things and focus on that one reality, the universal intelligence of reality, then we can see uh, all of these objects and all of these sensations playing out in that reality as a luminous play, which fundamentally again is empty or made of light in that way. So that is brahmacharya. And then going to the fifth one, so there's five yams and five niyams.
Mhm.
So the fifth yam is non-stealing. And this is also very interesting, right? I mean, when we hear the word non-stealing, I mean, it means, yeah, like don't steal what belongs to the people. But there's actually a much more, again, just like the first one and just like the other ones, there's a much more internal experience of that is more relevant here, right? And the reason for that is because there are ways in which we also glorify stealing, right? I mean, the stories of Robin Hood, we all connect with those stories, and fundamentally they were stealing. So, you know, based on that, we cannot really say that they were not on the path of yoga. Maybe they were on the path of yoga. Okay? But stealing really means that this life that exists within us, it doesn't belong to anyone, right? It just exists as part of this universal reality here, as part of this universal existence. And we are stewarding this life in this one form that we exist. And when I say form, I mean, I'm talking about the physical, the mental, the emotional, and all the bodies in which, and many traditions explain that in many different ways, right? So all those bodies are the ways in which this energy, this life force takes shape, and we steward that, right? But we don't own it. So stealing really means that whenever we put our awareness and an attention towards some things where a life force is stolen, um, right? That's the essence of stealing. Or when we maneuver in a way where we invite someone else's life force to be stolen, or we steal someone else's life form, right? Uh, then we move away from this yam of not stealing. So it's basically just saying that um, that we experience life again as in this non-dualistic way. We experience life and objects and everything as just an extension of ourselves, which basically means it's just the experience of life that is happening, rather than us trying to cling to it and trying to um, steal that energy or whatever we think we want to do, or you know. Um, And so one of the ways in which that happens, one of the ways we can practice that is by just practicing not assigning labels to our experiences as much. Because what happens when we assign label is that we obviously separate ourselves from that label, because then we said this is who I am and this is what that thing is. And at the same time, when we assign label to a certain thing, we lose the life-giving, the emergent quality of that thing. So, for instance, let's say, I mean, a very tangible thing. If I have a spoon in front of me and I find the label spoon, then I know how I can use the spoon. I know how to use the spoon, right? I lose the sense that maybe the spoon has other qualities to it. Maybe there's a quality to the metal that exists that otherwise we would not relate with if if we assign that label. So it's about, in a way, this yam of non-stealing is a very relational yam. What it says is that, stop applying labels to other things, come into a relationship with the other thing as if that is also an expression of life, and allow that relationship, that relational presence to unfold and teach you how things are and how things can be used or experienced in that way. Okay, so these are the five yams. So before I go forward with the five niyams, I just want to open up maybe for just a couple minutes just so that I don't bombard with a lot of information here.
Are you opening the floor for comments and questions right now?
Yes, yeah. I
Okay,
actually did not finish my sentence. I realized it. Left it hanging. But yes, I just want to open comments or questions around that.
Diana.
Yeah, thank you. This has been very enlightening in so many levels. And the truth is, I heard you the whole thing, but I was really struck by the first two as nonviolence, and that judgment is a form of violence because it separates us. And that was really an interesting thought, because you don't think of violence as a judgment. And I thought that that was really powerful, and that it says what we like and don't like, and that we're not all one, and it moves us out of the present flow into a dualistic way of being, and to see that as violence. And I think that's a lot of what's going on in the world, is because we are seeing the separation. We are seeing they, them instead of all of us. And so the idea that judgment is a form of violence separating from that thing felt really important to me. Thank you. It was just something that I hadn't thought of in that way. And the other one, this whole idea of falsehood and self-deception, is that we don't trust ourselves. And that was a very interesting experience too, because we're not getting our validation from when we don't trust ourselves and we're doing falsehoods, we're not seeing the oneness of everything, and we're expecting outside validation. And so I think this idea of the non-existence of life and the will is really, how do we become aware when we are in falsehood or self-deception or nonviolence, or even the non-clinging or universal reality. But the first two really struck me, because those were ways of seeing those words that I haven't really thought about. And I think they're really, really important. So that was an amazing talk. So thank you so much. It was really helpful for me.
Thank you, Dan. That's such a pertinent comment to what is happening around the world. Thank you for reflecting on that. Appreciate it.
That non-judgment was also very powerful for me. I'm sort of always in judgment. And I guess that makes me pretty violent, but that is also related to trusting yourself. But the one that I wanted to ask you about was your relationship to objects. Like, if I was a painter and I have a particular brush, or I have a relationship with my brushes, or I think of using a spoon or a fork as a brush, or talk about objects, because I am very object oriented.
Yeah. Do you have a question there, Adela, that you're curious about, or you just want to hear more about that?
I just want to hear more about that, because I think my attachment is more to things than to people. And I was a little worried about that.
Yeah, and this is why I say that yoga is a practice that we do as a way for us to experience this path towards union, right? Or to experience that sense of non-duality in the diversity of life. And when we connect with that wisdom is when we actually bring our experience of that wisdom into a reality, a very tangible reality, right? So it's not necessarily something that I would recommend, just go and do right off the bat kind of a thing, because there is a way in which the system and the structure kind of like position us in certain ways that makes it at least difficult to really connect with the wisdom of these words, right, of these practices. But speaking more to the objects there, right? So the practice itself basically says that in some of the more tangible ways, it just says that instead of looking at the objects how you have looked at it for your entire life, maybe open up space to look at them differently, right? And maybe even open up space to not even look at them differently, but just for them to show you what they are shaping up in that moment, right? And it's very interesting because I come from India, and in India, especially in my parents' generation, we were coming out of the colonial rule, and there was a lot of poverty and stuff like that, and people would have multiple users for like a simple thing, right? And it was really the creativity that allowed them to like look at a spoon in like 15 different ways, or look at a brush in so many different ways, right? But that's really it's taking that essence, but it's saying that just come into a relationship with what it is, right? So like if I'm a painter and I'm painting a picture, it's a whole different experience where I'm not allowing my mind to label all the things that are happening, but let myself express myself in the way with all the objects that I have in a way that is very relational, so the painting can emerge in this very relational way, right? Instead of saying that I have this idea and I'm like going to paint it, but it's saying that, yeah, this is who I am showing up. This is what it is. And there is this life energy that is driving all of these things together in some fashion. And I'm just present for that relationship.
Thank you.
Bush.
Let's lower my hand. I guess my question is kind of a segue into the title of today's talk about yoga and will. And so the little book that Renee and I have in our library about Patanjali's yoga aphorisms, very small book, but it's really jam-packed with a lot of powerful stuff. But the second sloka, the second verse, is the one that you referred to as the most well-known. In this book, it's translated as yoga or concentration is the hindering of the modifications of the thinking principle, or the modifications is like that whirlpool that you're talking about. And so the thinking principle is the mind, I suppose, or you also mentioned it's consciousness as well. But what is will? Is the seat of will also in the mind, or is it consciousness? And it's the will, I guess, that's controlling this whirlpool. So can you, from a Eastern perspective, how does one look at the will as the same or different than the mind?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Cliff, and maybe we can go into that. And I saw Bob, you were going to speak as well, or can we wait until after I respond to Cliff?
He's going to actually give the second part of his talk about the niyams. So maybe we'll hear it once
Okay.
it's that.
Fantastic. Okay, so but just going into a little segue here, because the question was brought in, and I think this might still be a good time to actually bring in this aspect of will, and then we can go into niyam as well. The reason I actually wanted to go into yam, and this is connected to the will, is because to understand will, we have to understand that it's not a function of the mind in this way, in the way that it's described. It's not even a function of our body, if you will. It's a function of a universal reality, right? And it's a function, and one of the ways to understand that is that all the way to the starting, right, where there is no sense of separation, right? It's maybe one of those states where we are just waking up from a sleep state, right? So that space where we don't really have a good sense of like, I am separate, I'm this body, and I'm, this is this room, and so on. The notion of will really starts there, right? Whatever seed that is sown at that time becomes the will. So will is, in this sense, the first notion of differentiation, but not separation, and which is an interesting thing to say, right? What it says is that if I'm sitting here and I'm looking at the trees, so I'm really just saying that me and the trees are just the one thing, but there is a sense of like the tree and me there is some sense of differentiation, but we are essentially the same. It's the same will, which in Bible also, it says, there was the word, and the first word was with God, right? It's that notion of will. The thing is that as we experience life, we are constantly willing things to be in a certain way, and we are interpreting a mind. We are using a mind to interpret what we are willing to be, in a particular situation. And that is very much dependent on some of these underlying impressions through the way in which mind works. It's like, when you're in love, you love everything about that person. And when you fall out of love, like the same things you really hate about that person, right? It's like, how does that happen, right? That's the impressions that we have that are underlying that sense or that essence, right? And we kind of lose track of where that will is coming from. We kind of like automatically kind of fall into it in a way. But when we become aware of it, then we can really choose to move into the reality with a lot of integrity and a lot of power that way. So will and power are very closely related that way as well. In Buddhism, will actually, ironically, is not very super ironically, but it might seem that way, is connected with equality. Like that's the word. So will and equality are actually, they use it interchangeably. It's because it says that once I come into recognition that I am of the same essence as everything else, I'm no separate from everything else, then naturally there is an implosion of will. There is something that happens where we go from this confused state of mind and trying to grasp something or trying to run away from something to say, well, if I'm not separate from anything else, then this is the thing that must be done. It's just this deep care about the world, right? It's a care that maybe sometimes we experience when we really care for something, right? When we really don't separate ourselves from the thing that we are caring, and then there's this just implosion of power and force that comes in, and that's will. Okay.
I just want to say that's super cool, what you just said. I love that.
Yeah, thank you, Clive. So going into niyams, and I try to be a little quicker on this one. So niyams, as I was saying, is some kind of like positive practices that we can cultivate, loosely translating the word. And typically people, the way people understand that is how you cultivate your environment. So there is a sense of like cleanliness and so on, right? But again, like I want to go into this from the same kind of perspective or lens that we are working through right now. So one of the first will is around first niyam is around surrender, right? So it's a practice, a positive practice of surrender. And surrender is just basically what it means here, right? It's surrendering one's own individualness, one's own separateness into this universal reality, right? And one of the markers to see when we are struggling with surrendering is when there is a constriction that we are experiencing. So a constriction is naturally a force of the ego, because a constriction says that I am separating myself from everything else, and because I'm separating myself from everything else, I have to make it just like this, right? Like I have to identify it just like this. So internally, we experience that constriction as, constriction of our muscles, constriction of our nervous system, constriction of our channels. And that is something that we can familiarize ourselves with. And the practice of surrender means really just breathe into it, and surrender into the space around that constriction doesn't need to exist for this practice. So it's really cultivating a soft and stable space within ourselves. The second niyam is around perseverance. And it also has many different interpretations, but it's not just perseverance in the sense of like just going through difficulties, right? Because I just talked about constriction in my first niyam. So there is a sense of preserving oneself, which can be constricted, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about here is perseverance in the sense of like cultivating that inner fire so that I can be relaxed and I can be surrendered. I can still move like the fire does, right? And it's basically that perseverance really means is that it's burning everything that is non-essential, right? Everything that is the play of the mind or the play of the ego or the play of something that is not in integrity. It's just burning away all of that, and it's staying true to that path, right? So that's perseverance. The third one is around self-reflection or moving away from ignorance, right? And this is not the same, at least in the way it's described. It's not the same as self-deception. It was a yam, which was a practice that we cultivate internally. We control this energy of deceiving ourselves. Self-reflection is a way in which we like move away from the multiplicity of all these things. We move away from the one who's even observing all those things, and kind of like just practice being in silence, practice being in that level of utmost surrender that there's not even an observer who's trying to observe something. And what happens is that then we naturally step into this kind of like we become aware of just the energy that exists and nothing else. And when we become aware of that energy, we start moving away from ignorance. So ignorance again is this essence of identifying ourselves as being separate from everything else, the nature of ego. And it's that essence that it's not even just realizing the truth, it's that there is nothing but the truth. Like even I don't exist, right? It's coming to that sense of practice where I can say even I don't exist. It's all the same, right? And so that is the practice of self-reflection in that way. And then the third one and the fourth one, I think, is it's about cleanliness. It's about decluttering things. But really what it really means is that we are decluttering our mind, right? So we are moving away from the state of confusion. We're moving away from the mind being absorbed in the multiplicity of things. And we are just practicing clarity, right? And again, in yoga, there is practices for each of these yam and niyams on how to do that. There is meditative practices and other practices, and and we obviously won't have time to go in those ones, but basically that's just what it means. And one can recognize that, right? Like when things are very cluttered around us, then typically, not always, but typically we also feel cluttered inside. It's because the mind is, in a sense, kind of associating with all these existences of these things, right? But I do want to say that I had a friend who actually felt much more at peace when things around him were cluttered. So, I mean, I don't want to go to him and tell him that, hey, declutter your surroundings, because it really means is that, if you're experiencing a sense of clarity within yourself, if your mind is not cluttered with all these things, and generally the things that the mind gets cluttered with are the things that we don't really enjoy. We still keep them in our minds. So this practice really says that let's just get rid of all of that, right? The true essence of reality is, as I said, Sat Chit Anand, which is just, it's filled with this utmost potential consciousness, which is the truth and which is blissful in its truthness. And then the last one is around contentment. It's around just recognizing that everything is just okay. That there is nothing really we need to do to make things okay. It's recognizing, again, in this non-dual way, and again, this is a practice. Typically, the way we practice yam and yams is, we go through each one in this step-by-step fashion so that we can come to a place where we can actually believe that, yeah, everything is really okay. It's life playing out in its myriads of ways, that everything is just okay. And this is really important because this everything is okay. It doesn't take us away from that inner fire, right? It's in the recognition of all of that we are here and we can say that everything is just okay. So that's the nature of contentment. And it's also something that also moves us away from conflict, right? It moves us away from being so critically minded that we lose the essence of what is being presented and what is outside us, right? Sometimes, when two people are talking and somebody says something and they're trying to bring out a certain essence, but they might use a wrong word, or they might maybe not be very precise and accurate in the way they say it. There's a sense in which the mind can attach to that particular word or that particular kind of like non-accuracy or non-preciseness of the thing, right? But what this practice says is that, well, if everything is okay, then can I just recognize the essence in which everything is okay and be true to that, right? So this is where we complete our 5 niyams as well, and there's so much more to say around these, but I'll pause here and then kind of just finishing this really, and we already talked about will, right? So what happens with these yoga sutras is that once we start practicing yam and niyam, that's really a daily practice. That's something that we can connect with on a day in, day out, right? And then it goes into the rest of the 6, which is basically asanas is the third one, which is essentially keeping a physical body stronger. But there's something more to that also. What it says, asana says, is that once we practice this, once we are aware of this non-dual essence of being and non-dual reality, then we can experience life pose in different configurations. So when we pose in these different asanas, then we are also experiencing our life energy being configured in those very physical ways in that particular configuration. And so the practice of breathing and settling into a pose is about us recognizing the difference, this configuration that we don't generally, experience or walk with or sit with and so on.
Piyush, I just realized it's 3:56.
Yes, we have very much a time here.
Do you want to just do one thing about will and yoga, and then maybe we'll let everybody do a takeaway?
Yes. So
Okay.
essentially, when we go through all this practice, really what comes up is that we can recognize that non-dual aspect of will, right? We can recognize we settle into this non-dual reality where one can tangibly feel the power of that will. And that will is the will of transformation. That's the will that really brings us outwards into the world with integrity. And when we do that, when we move from that place, we do not build the karmic residues as opposed to when we do it from the mind. So That's the end.
Tying us back to last week of karma and transformation. Oh, perfect. Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. I just wish we had a whole nother hour. Not having that, why don't we give especially people who may not have had a chance to speak yet a chance to give us their takeaway from our conversation today. So on my screen, I see Michael, and then Sharane, Carolyn, Bob, Mary, Mariange, and Marisa.
Does that mean I go first?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I'm full of thoughts and ideas. I just want to, as a tangent, express my appreciation that you did it all with no PowerPoints, with no graphics. It was just really made it a lot clearer. I have many thoughts. Coming from the American tradition of pragmatism, I would say what I am most interested in is how to live better. And so I'm seeing so many parallels here. I'm also thinking about a theme that the center had a while back about the dynamic balance, the dynamic center. I think that's what we're talking about here. You know, I don't see a static universal, you know. I think this is about learning how to live better. So I'll just leave it there.
Very well said. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Sharane.
Thank you so much, Piyush. I'm a yoga asana instructor, so it was very interesting and amazing to hear your thoughts in all of those topics that, you know, I try to study every day and learn, but you definitely gave a brand new, beautiful perspective. My takeaway, especially from the answer to Cliff question, that was very deep, but I was trying to catch everything. And I think my own conclusion of like what you said that really struck with me is that I always thought of will as a force, as this energy, right? That kind of like lets you forward or like ask you to do this thing or our minds too. And I'm thinking of it more right now like it's alignment with what matters the most rather than force. Will is more alignment. So just reflecting and thinking about that and how to expand on it. But thank you so much.
Brilliant, Sharone. Thank you. Carolyn.
Well, it was such a positive presentation. It was really good to hear that and show your experience and confidence in meditation. So unfortunately, I'm wondering, how does a meditator know that what they've hit upon is true, is correct, isn't falling to any trap of desire? And so is there anything cautionary that you would say about your discipline?
Yeah, that's I mean, when we go deeper into this, there is a real danger, I think, Caroline, and you're very wise to point towards that as well. People have used meditative practices, again, it doesn't matter east or west, but you know, for a long time to further their own agendas, right? And somehow goes in that direction sometimes. And I guess the one cautionary tale I would say, and that typically, I mean, well, one thing to recognize is that whenever that happens, that has the same kind of impact internally as it has externally as well. So one would feel this sense of chaos, or the sense of um, uh, kind of like this agitation inside, if we are not using these practices in the right way, even though we might see things happening out in the world that we wanted to, but it still wouldn't bring peace, or wouldn't bring joy or beauty internally, in the ways that we can believe. But the cautionary tale around this is really the aspect of non-identification. It's whenever we go into these practices, and we are holding on to an identification with something, either wanting something, or identification of who we are as something, then typically that means that there is a level of I guess the background present that can maybe move us into some of these darker realms. Yeah, it's good to be aware about them. It's good to, in the tradition, that's why they said that, when you're practicing these things, you always practicing it with a teacher, because the teacher can notice those things happening, and when they happen, then they can step in and either change the practice, or stop the practice, or do something else. But in the absence of the teacher, I think staying in integrity with oneself, which means that not uh, holding on to identifications when we are practicing it as much as possible, and feeling, in being very honest with it, with ourselves, that this is where we are. So that's what I would say.
Thank you.
Mhm. Great answer. Thank you. Bob.
Oh, thank you. Everything was very interesting, and as I was listening to you, I was thinking, well, there's a kind of a Buddhist counterpart to all of that thinking, and then you ended with everything is okay, and the starting point in Buddhism is everything is suffering. And I thought, well, that's an interesting way of putting it. But I think as you were talking about the being careful about where you go with these things, really suffering in Buddhism means to not accept things, to basically want things to be other than you want them to be. In other words, you're wanting something to be other than it is. And acceptance means accepting things as they are, surrendering to that. And I just found it all very interesting, because I think, the more you focus on coming back to that equality, that union, you get away from the sticking points, whatever they are. So if you say, well, the environment is so important, what should I do about it? You say, well, if you get away from the doing something about it, and well, you're not going to do anything about it until you care, and you're not going to care until you actually identify and love. And then you're going back again to what the yogic unity or equality is all about. And that kind of guides you through everything. So I was just really struck with that, of making something sacred before you do anything else. And of course, once you've made it sacred, it doesn't matter if it's a spoon or a brush or a dish, then you're able to act as one with it. So suddenly this cup becomes something that becomes a tea ceremony. It doesn't become an object out there that you want or don't want in a particular kind of way. And so I found it all extremely interesting, and most of it being, as you're saying, the duality of objectifying things or reifying things, as opposed to a certain feeling of where you start, your starting point. Anyway, that was my takeaway. That doesn't go anywhere. It just was interesting as I heard you talking.
Mm. That's one of the things that's so wonderful about us coming together. Gems from the wisdom traditions, plural. because it just gives these different perspectives of the same one reality. And to see it from somebody else's perspective, all of a sudden clarifies the one that we've been looking at it from to begin with. And it just makes it more multifaceted. I love the fact that both of you, all of us, are here together for those kinds of reasons. Mary, from the Catholic tradition.
Not really, not from the Catholic tradition, but I mahalo to Piyush and to everybody for their contributions. My takeaway is that you said usually the things that clutter our minds are things we don't enjoy. So I'm going to work on that.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. Thank you. And Marianne?
Like tradition. But thank you. This was beautiful, great, concise, and challenging, and superbly presented. Thank you so much. I reading about which are I would interpret as the suffering, and that if we really, the passions of the Desert Fathers, going back to the 4th, 5th, 6th century of Christianity, was focusing on letting it go, so this energy of our can radiate from us. And I feel that this gave a concise reason why I'm drawn to yoga, and the yamas and yans that give us this perspective and help us move through self-deception. I really love the idea that what's true and blissful could be consciousness, and what is conscious and blissful could be true. And it's just kind of like being in that energy and being a steward to that energy kind of gives an ease to daily life. So thank you so much. Beautiful, beautiful.
Certainly was. I'm in a place suddenly I got a message from the person who is going to deliver next week's presentation that it's just a little bit too close to home. He's with his mother in her final days in hospice, and our theme for next week is From Desire to Suffering. And so once again, I don't know how we will be proceeding forward with next week, just as I didn't know how we were going to proceed forward with this week. And so I'll just end with a little story, which is that I had already asked 6 different yoga teachers, and my husband, who is somebody who practices yoga without a single asana. And nobody could give a presentation. Even people who really wanted to were not able to. And unbeknownst to myself, on Wednesday, I sent out this little wink, wink, evidently to Piyush. Piyush came to mind, and I got a text on Thursday morning from Piyush, whom I haven't spoken with for at least a year, saying, Renee, I'm really thinking about you. How was everything going? Well, as a matter of fact. And so we had this lovely serendipity of Piyush very graciously agreeing to give us our presentation for today, and just giving us something that was, as some of you have already said, was so clear. Clear to the mind, and yet penetrating to our hearts, to our souls, that gave us something that we could use to live our lives with, as Michael was saying, in a way that I think makes every moment more precious and more meaningful as a result of what you were able to share with us, Piyush. You really touched us very much. Thank you so much. Mahalo.
Thank you, Renee. Thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here. Thank you.
Aloha.
Aloha. Thank you.
Thank
Mahalo.
Mm.
Thank you, Piyush. Bye-bye.
Mhm.